welcome back to the Land and Climate Podcast. My name is Alasdair, and in this episode I spoke to Andreas Malm and Wim Carton, academics and authors from Lund University, about their long-awaited new book, Overshoot, How the World Surrendered to Climate Breakdown, which is an analysis and account of how the world has seemingly thrown in the towel in its fight against global warming, and how established interests have too much to lose to change the course of ever fiercer warming.
It's a lack of imagination and a complete submission to mainstream economics. That is the ideological core of the models, and that is also the ideological core, of course, of everything we have that prevents us from being more radical or more ambitious in terms of mitigation.
Wim Carton is an academic researching the political economy of efforts to fight climate change, and has previously examined the use of carbon removal and climate modelling in climate policymaking. And Andreas Malm, as well as being an academic on human ecology, is perhaps best known as the author of the bestseller book on climate activism, How to Blow Up a Pipeline. I began by asking Wim Carton to explain the concept of overshoot.
In the book, we deal with overshoot in two ways. So overshoot is two different things. We talk about programmatic overshoot, and that is this proposal that emerged in models, but that is now kind of, moving out into the real world, that once we cross these temperature targets that were established in the Paris Agreement, we don't necessarily have to give up on them. So crossing them doesn't necessarily mean that we failed, but that we at some point later can lower temperatures again to again stay within them by using negative emissions. So it essentially means that we've extended the period within which we can reach these targets by first overshooting them. That's this idea of programmatic overshoot, and it's a scenario analysis, but it's a policy proposal, right? It's a set of proposals for the road by which we're going to reach these targets. The last, I don't know how many months it is now, 14 months, 15 months in a row have beaten temperature records 1 month after the other, many of which have actually already been above 1.5 degrees for brief periods of time. We also talk about these, the forces, the dynamics that actually are propelling us beyond these thresholds, right? So it's both the programmatic proposal, but then also the actual crossing of the thresholds itself.
Can you now go into some of the history of Overshoot? I mean, give us a sense of how this policy proposal or narrative has developed.
I mean, in the book, we have kind of this long-term perspective in the sense that, we talk about, first of all, the emergence of this notion of temperature limits as the way in which climate politics has been constructed, like these absolute limits within which we need to stay to avoid dangerous warming. That has been the kind of narrative that we've had all the time. And of course, the IPCC report, 1.5 degree report, is the perfect example. And so essentially what happened is that as climate science moved towards this framing of temperature limits, because climate science hasn't always worked with the 2 degree target or temperature targets, once it moved towards that, based in large part because that became a politically attractive target, the 2 degree target, for example, came out of the European Union, really wanting to put this on the international negotiation agenda. Once that happened, the people who've been providing us with these pathways by which we can do mitigation and stay within these limits had to come up with ways of doing that. And there we get into this situation where, for a very long time, if you would have translated the old modeling stuff to these temperature targets, before they used temperature targets, very few of them were compatible with this notion of staying within 2 degrees, let alone 1.5. And that is because of the assumptions that were built into the model. So we spend a lot of time unpacking these assumptions in this book, right? Because it's a core, what we call overshoot ideology. It's a core kind of aspect of this problematic notion that staying within a limit is the same as shooting past it and then somehow dropping below it afterwards again. To be compatible with these temperature targets that were then agreed politically, the models had to come up with some kind of notion of doing that. And what they came up with was this large-scale carbon removal, essentially. And large-scale carbon removal in multiple ways, right? If you look at the IPCC report, removal fulfills multiple functions. The one we're talking about mostly in this book is this function of, by 2100, you can suck enough CO2 out of the atmosphere to lower temperatures, which means that you can have a peak somewhere during this century, and then that peak does not necessarily correspond to the end point. The end point can be lower and can be below your temperature target. So around 2007, 2008, thereabouts, we had this kind of first proposals by modeling teams that this was one way in which these very economically centered models, cost optimizing models that otherwise were not compatible with these temperature targets, could somehow anyway help us reach these things by working with this future mortgaging, right? It's essentially build up a debt that you then have to pay back in the second half of the century because you've emitted too much and you need to remove it again. So the history that we outline in detail in this book is this history of, in parallel, the models that have entered this into all these scenarios, the politics that become reliant on it.
Yeah, and when we've spoken to you before, you were very critical of the integrated assessment model. But in this book, you really emphasize how damaging they've been and that modelers have really underestimated the power of all sorts of other possibilities of behavior change, the cost of renewables. Was there an intent in that? Or do you think it's part of a kind of institutional psychology which existed in the creation of the models?
There's an interesting history in the sense that the integrated assessment models in part come out of the work during the 70s of the oil and gas company. Shell, for example, was one of the pioneers of this kind of scenario work. There is, historical legacy of this modeling that directly goes back into fossil capital. And I think this is clear what this book shows, right? I think it would be too simplistic to look for intentional attempts to, obfuscate or delay or whatever on the part of the modeler. For the most part, at least, that's not how this works. And this is why we're talking about overshoot ideology. We talk about passive capital protection, right? What these models do is they protect these assets that would otherwise strand. And it's a lack of imagination and a complete submission to mainstream economics. That is the ideological core of the models. And that is also the ideological core, of course, of everything we have that prevents us from being more radical or more ambitious in terms of mitigation. Because everything has to be so gradual and everything has to be, we can't possibly shut down things before their economic lifetime has been depleted and stuff. It's by design, by ideology, not by intent, I would say.
I think it'd be quite important for listeners just to go through, if possible, even as a kind of quick summary, the kind of number of different stages at which you think the idea develops.
It was first proposed early in the 21st century, I think around 2003, 4, something like that, by scholars who argued that it's already very likely that any limits to the warming will be exceeded, but that we can deal with this kind of overshoot in various ways. So the 3 ways for dealing with it that were originally proposed are adaptation, carbon dioxide removal, and geoengineering. The idea then being that, okay, we might have to, because the process is unstoppable, go beyond a certain temperature limit that we've set, and then we have to deal with this in some other way. One is to adapt, to try to learn to live with it. One is carbon dioxide removal, which has the potential to actually take the CO2 that we can't help but emitting back down. And one is, the third option, solar geoengineering, which can potentially shave off the peak of the heat, as the phrase goes, and undo some of the warming caused by CO2 and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Now, the focus in this book, and also in our volume 2 sequel that is coming, a much longer and more comprehensive study of at least this problem, is on carbon dioxide removal. The idea with it being precisely that by rolling out technologies for capturing CO2 and sequestering it and taking it back down to Earth, we can later on cancel out this transgression of a temperature limit. So if the temperature goes up to 2 or 3 degrees, we can then go back down to, for instance, 1.5 by means of these technologies. And in that sense, the notion of overshoot became enormously widespread and popular in a lot of climate science and politics, particularly, I guess, around the time of the Paris Agreement and also the special report by the IPCC on 1.5 degrees that came out in 2018. And the great advantage then of this idea is that it seems to produce this kind of flexibility that, okay, fine, we can miss the 1.5 degree target or even the 2 degree target, because later on, towards the end of this century, we'll have these technologies for sucking the CO2 out of the atmosphere again and pumping it back down to Earth. And what we show in this book is that this whole notion was based on a kind of fiction from the start, because the technology that was supposed to do this work, primarily what's known as bioenergy carbon capture and storage, or BECCS, is a technology that doesn't exist and that didn't have any kind of material physical existence at the time when the models completely predicated the idea of overshoot on a massive rollout of this technology towards the end of the century. But our idea of passive capital protection here is that the real ideological work that the overshoot concept did in these models was and still is to stave off the capital destruction that is implicit in mitigation. So to actually cut emissions, to stay below a particular temperature limit, you need to destroy a lot of capital, the capital that is invested in fossil fuel production. And that is going to be, if it ever happens, a very serious blow to capitalist class interests. And it's a blow that this class has kind of preemptively protected itself against in multiple ways. And the notion of overshoot and these future negative emissions technologies are only one of the strategies, of course, for this kind of protection.
And maybe that's the time, Andreas, to then go on to the concept of stranded assets.
Yeah, stranded assets, it's precisely this, the recognition and realization. I mean, it came about in the wake of the financial crisis of 2008, that if governments ever actually get serious about cutting emissions, this implies that oil and gas and coal companies can no longer use their assets. And they have built up enormous amounts of fixed capital in the form of oil platforms and gas pipelines and coal mines and all the rest of it. And the morning when mitigation actually begins and states say that now we're going to actually get rid of fossil fuels, these assets will become stranded, meaning that they will lose their value because the companies won't be able to go on as expected and recuperate their investments and keep producing profit from all this investment. And the fear, the kind of scenario that has been around for a long time is that if this ever happens, it could trigger a massive financial meltdown, much worse than what happened in 2008, because the fossil fuel companies, to begin with, have a large chunk of the stock exchanges in London and New York and elsewhere is directly made up by the stocks from these companies. And if they lose a lot of value more or less overnight, because it becomes clear that these companies can no longer exploit their reserves that serve as a kind of foundation for their stock value. So, for instance, if it would become clear that BP or Total can no longer use the reserves, that the deficits that they have claimed as the future for their production, then they will lose their stock value, and that could potentially spread through the financial system. And you would have other companies, banks, for instance, that have given loan to these fossil fuel companies, suffering from various kinds of indirect financial blows. And it could possibly bring down a lot of the financial system. This is the scenario that has been around since the early 2010s or something like that. And fossil fuel companies are extremely keen on protecting their assets and continuing with their business models. And so are banks and asset managers and other financial institutions that keep pouring capital into these companies. And of course, the most urgent problem, in a sense, is the ongoing boom in fossil fuel extraction that has taken off, particularly since 2002, when there was this historical profit bonanza in the oil and gas industry in particular that has caused the completely out of control pouring of capital into new platforms and pipelines and mines and all the rest, which means that capitalist class interests are becoming even more deeply embedded and invested in fossil fuel production because they have fresh capital that awaits recovery and a yield in the years and decades ahead. So a company like Saudi Aramco, for instance, that is undertaking the largest capital expenditure program in its history, will be extremely resistant to the idea of getting off fossil fuels now. They have just poured so much more capital into expanding their assets. Although we should point out that the country where most of this expansion is happening is the US. It's the world's leading oil and gas producer now, and it's where these processes are really completely out of control.
And so your kind of conclusion is that there's just too much to lose and that only radical change is possible?
Tendency or push or thrust to come up with other things than emissions cuts. We're going to do other things because we just can't stomach the idea that we have to lose all this capital, all these profits that we can make from fossil fuels. It's not that fossil fuels fit in any essential human needs, and we spend some time in the book making the case for this, that they could actually be advantageously replaced with solar and wind primarily. But fossil fuels are an incredibly profitable source of energy. And just because we can't accept the idea of closing down that source, we have to come up with these ideas of doing other things, like adapting by various kinds of technologies, have water bombers to bomb the wildfires in France, or by having BECCS or direct air capture or some other negative emissions technology that can take the CO2 back down after we have emitted it, or have sulfate planes that can do solar geoengineering.
Yeah, and I mean, coming back to this notion of the different moments of the overshoot conjuncture in the history, this is exactly what you see. I mean, the history of these negotiations has been going on in parallel to this ongoing attempts to do something else. So there was disclosure, there was carbon capture, right? We've had carbon offsetting as well. We've had all these attempts to come up with alternatives to do this kind of massive asset stranding that is needed. And the overshoot conjuncture is kind of the culmination of that. It's the inevitable end result of this logic, I would say.
I think your book kind of sets out that overshoot is the most likely thing that will continue for a while. But do you think that there can be radical change and that this radical change is possible?
My answer to that would be yes, in the sense that it is possible. Another question, but it's not the one that you asked, but another question is it likely to happen? No. The likely course, because it's the course we're on, is just continued overshoot and attempts to adapt and remove carbon dioxide and geoengineer the climate. These attempts are quite likely to be unsuccessful and potentially disastrous, particularly when it comes to geoengineering, which comes with all these side effects and the ultimate specter of the termination shock that could completely destroy this planet. But this is the kind of trajectory that we're on.
But do you think that those that are proposing things like geoengineering, carbon dioxide removal, are genuinely serious about these as proposals, rather than it just being a short-term investor, let's just make the money while we can and we'll think about a solution later?
Well, no, there are very serious scholars who advocate geoengineering as the best or the necessary option, and I don't think they fake it because they want to make money or their pals want to make money. And I think that there are also well-intentioned people who would claim that geoengineering is necessary or unavoidable. So it's much more complicated than just saying these are evil people who are trying to dupe us. What is likely is one thing. What we should do is another. And, when you form your ideas about what kind of political intervention you should make, it's never a question of aligning with probability, because then you can just stay at home and see the world to run its course. It's precisely because of the very high likelihood of all these things happening, including geoengineering, that the urgency of trying to intervene and actually shut down the sources becomes larger, the unlikelihood of a solution is why it has to be fought for.
You give Ecuador as an example of a kind of single place where stranded assets were at least attempted, and that's kind of still in development. I mean, there was even news about it last week. Towards the end of your book, and maybe this is because you've got part two, the solution side is shorter than the analysis. And I wondered whether that is because, you're kind of like, well, it's just obvious. It's quite a radical solution. It's clear what that solution is, but it's a fairly simple solution. Therefore, we don't need to set it out in that much detail.
You're entirely right, of course. It's much shorter. But I think we're also very clear that it would be pretentious to say that we have the solution, right? I mean, there's so many people working on this. The point, rather, is that there's not enough critical attention on this crucial question: how do you strand these assets, right? There's all this focus on scaling renewables, and people are doing awesome work on all kinds of things. How to strand the assets, which is the fundamental question in climate politics, of course, there's the non-proliferation treaty, there's initiatives, but it's certainly not the main focus. And that's where I think more attention needs to be focused. And I think that we're suggesting.
On Ecuador, I'm not up to date with the most recent developments there, but I think that Colombia is more significant because unlike Ecuador, Colombia is actually run by a government with very progressive ideas about ecology. And it is the most significant fossil fuel producer that now is under the control of people who want to stop fossil fuel extraction. Now, like every political project, this project has its problems and is running into various kinds of difficulties and resistance, naturally, from fossil fuel interests. But I think what Gustavo Petro and the others in charge of Colombia now are trying to do is the most inspiring case that we have right now. And I think it's quite remarkable that you have a country like this, which is obviously in the global south and is extremely dependent on revenues from coal and oil, moving ahead of everyone else and saying that we're going to phase out these industries when, of some kind of rational expectation would be that it would be rich countries who are in a much better position to deal with this kind of phase out. I mean, a country like Norway or the US or Canada would have so much more resources to have a smooth transition away from fossil fuels than a country like Colombia, but still it happens there. And it's of course because Latin America is the part of the world where you still have a situation where left-wing forces can actually seize state power through winning democratic elections. Well, they can in other countries too, obviously, like here in France, you just had a left force winning a popular democratic election, but that victory is being stolen by Macron. So it's not that it only happens in Latin America, but Latin America is unique still as a laboratory for left-wing politics.
Can we go back to one of the points that you kind of opened the book with around the arguments about 1.5 and crossing over it, in a sense, and the argument between what you called the kind of the voluntarists for 1.5, and I don't know who's better to answer on that. I just wondered, from that sensible position on 1.5 should now be, are you suggesting really that, we should just ignore that, just go for the asset stranding and forget really a discussion around this breaching of a limit?
I don't know if I've thought through a coherent answer on this, but I think this is really tricky because, there are definitely people arguing that we should just, dismiss with temperature targets altogether because, they come with this idea of at some point there's a steep drop and then, after 1.5, everything's lost. But it's also not the case that they're meaningless, right? They do signify something. If you look at the IPCC report on 1.5, for example, 1.5 is significantly safer than 2 degrees. So I think it comes back to this notion of the possible and the likely somehow, right? Obviously, to be a 1.5 voluntarist at this point and say that, we can still stay within 1.5 degrees when we're really very close to crossing it, it requires a very, strong stomach. Obviously, biophysically, it is possible. There's no warming in the pipeline or whatever. But obviously, you would need such a massive change in society that it's, for every incremental year where we still have not peaked emissions, globally, it becomes harder and harder to see what that would look like. And this comes back to this point made earlier. I think we have a responsibility on the left to keep pushing the boundaries of what is possible, because otherwise you enter into this default position of just, aligning with what mainstream bourgeois economists say what is possible, and that is inevitably going to be insufficient. There's a political case for, keep pushing for seemingly impossible temperature limits, I would say. And even if we cross them, it doesn't matter, right? I mean, the political program is exactly the same. It's stranding these assets. It doesn't matter if, you have to do it as soon as possible. And if it means that you fly past 1.5 degrees anyway, then at least you stop them before the next limit. Nothing changes when we cross that limit in terms of what needs to be done. And therefore, I think you don't lose anything by actually pushing for that limit.
So there is a part 2 to this. And I just wanted to ask a little bit more about why you decided to do this.
The real distinction is that the first volume kind of sets up the history of Overshoot and the battle lines around mitigation, while the second volume goes into carbon removal, geoengineering, and adaptation in detail. And it just shows what those multiplying front lines are, what it actually means. So, for example, we spend a lot of time talking about the notion of reversibility in volume 2, the idea that one can actually suck CO2 out of the atmosphere, and that would somehow put climate change in reverse, which is fundamental to the Overshoot conjuncture. So we go through the science on this, but also then the political economy of actually who's pushing for this. And then we just completely dissect this landscape of all these carbon removal proposals for that program that is necessary to deliver Overshoot. That's the largest part of volume 2. And then geoengineering is the kind of second largest part, because these are ultimately the technologies that you need to make Overshoot a feasible project. As to why we did this, we're at a moment in time where this is a totally necessary form of analysis, I think. So these are in many ways going to be the defining questions of climate politics in the decades to come. And I think we need to grapple with them. And we felt it's necessary to spend some time and energy analyzing it. These are not pamphlet books. They're really like, we try to both theorize and, empirically delve into this in a lot of detail. And I hope it stands as an analysis for whatever the future may bring, right?
Is this analysis really the first out there saying this? Or are you developing on existing ideas? Are there others out there to support this now? I know that in terms of some of the solutions you're saying, well, governments need to change and they need to adopt more radical policies on stranding assets. But are there allies in what you're saying at the moment?
Yeah, sure. But it's a question of the climate movement in the global north and in Europe, perhaps more specifically, being extremely vigorous between 2018 and 2020. And then after the pandemic, struggling to regain its momentum and losing a lot of momentum in certain key countries, particularly Germany, where it's very fragmented and a shadow of its former self for various different reasons. But here in France, for instance, the situation is the opposite. You have a sort of the movement that has taken over the torch from the German movement. Personally, this is the kind of scene that I identify with, which is an extra parliamentary social movement to try to intervene in these disastrous trajectories. Again, a force so powerful that it's anywhere near likely to win at the current stage. But I don't see any other reason to hope for change than that social movements become stronger, continue with what they're doing, but become much stronger than what they are now, because the kind of changes needed will not happen by the ruling classes of their own accord, of their own volition, of their, sudden insight, changing their behavior. It's going to happen by force being exerted from outside by social movements.
Thanks very much to Wim Carton and Andreas Malm for their time. As usual, we have further reading on this topic, including a link to the new book, which will be published by Verso on 1st of October. Thanks also to Vasco Kostovsky for the audio production in this episode, and Bertie Harrison-Berninski will be back in a few weeks' time for our next podcast. Do remember to follow our podcast for new episodes if you found it interesting, and thanks very much for listening.